Good morning, colleague. Let me see who we got connected. Yeah, we do have a good 21 people connected, so I think we can start. That's okay. I was going to ask if we could give three more minutes for whoever might want to join, but what do you think? We get started, or we give it 2 more minutes?
Well, I'm ready to start when everyone's ready. So
okay, maybe 2 more minutes for those who might still be struggling to join. Okay. Jean-Paul, are you in Addis?
I am in Addis, but I had not realized that we had the conference room available, so I connected virtually.
Right. Okay. As I saw the flash, the conference room, I was expecting to see you walk in.
Well, I could still go there, but then we waste another 5 minutes for me to do that. So
that's fine. We have you. It's loud. It's clear. So let's run with this. So I think we should start now. Good morning, colleagues, dear peers, journalists, members of the press. Thank you very much for showing up. A few rules, housekeeping. The interpretation section, they've kindly advised that we adhere to a few things. So number one is that you should be aware that this is being translated into French because it's in English. So the lower right side of your screen, you would see the interpretation logo, and then you click on that and then you take the option. If you want to listen to it in English, then you can do so. If you want to listen to it in French, you take that option. So interpretation is available. And if you'd like to speak, there is an option for you to request to speak. Then you'll be granted the floor for you to make your intervention. And right after that, we've been asked to kindly turn off our video if you're not speaking, just to, for the sake of the bandwidth, to help those who are struggling with bandwidth. And then, of course, you mute yourself when you're not speaking. And then, of course, make use of the chat box. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, you can quickly drop them there, and then we'll take it from there. That said, I'm not going to rant a lot, just welcoming you to this press briefing as the second of the ECN monthly press briefing, and want to thank our director, Jean-Paul, for availing himself to do with this, despite very tight schedule with lots of things going on. As you know, is that lots of talks happening now ahead of COP27. And that's why, we decided to focus this press briefing on COP27, which has been dubbed Africa's COP. So Jean-Paul, I'm not going to do a lot of talking because you are here. So I'll let you do your thing, is that you do your presentation. And right after that, we're going to open it up for journalists to ask questions. If that's okay with you, then let's get started.
Thank you very much, Ernest. We appreciate the opportunity to undertake this briefing for all journalists. And my presentation will take hopefully just a little bit less than 20 minutes. And after which I will be available for questions. And don't hesitate to also ask questions in French. I can answer also. Je peux répondre aussi en français. So today's presentation is on the road to COP27, and I'll be highlighting some of Africa's opportunities and priorities, and also some of the actions that the ECA is doing to support those processes. So firstly, let's recap very briefly the progress or also limitations that have occurred following COP26 and leading to COP27. So one of while there was progress and there was increased ambition at COP26, even if those 2030 nationally determined contributions are achieved, the world will be on track for 2.4 degrees of warming. And therefore, dramatic more ambition is needed at COP27. And this is one of the key elements that African countries are emphasizing. There is also a need for a just transition, and that means recognizing Africa's different starting point. Africa still has to address its industrialization needs and is actually currently net positive, as there are as Africa's emissions are totaling less than 4% of global emissions, while representing 17% of the world's population, and also harboring some of the world's most important carbon sinks, such as the Congo Basin peatlands, which alone account for the equivalent, they absorb the equivalent of 3 years worth of global emissions. And so one of the key elements of a just transition is improving access to energy as part of the pathway towards achieving net zero. And we should be clear that in a just transition, while Africa will need more space to address its energy needs, and that includes in some cases increasing access to fossil fuels, the pathway to net zero is still essential as part of achieving climate goals. In terms of adaptation, there was progress at COP26 in terms of the commitment for at least 50% of finance being allocated to adaptation. And COP26 also established and launched the 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on establishing a global goal on adaptation. In terms of loss and damage, there was the move towards recognition of the problem towards more quantification. And the starting point for finance, which was expressed by African negotiators, was 1.3 trillion US dollars. One of the key elements that will be required is further clarification on breaking down this figure as to how much will be required as grants, for example, and how much can be invested by the private sector, and how much can be also leveraged as loans. It is obvious that the majority in the context of very vulnerable countries has to come as grants, but this needs to be defined very clearly. And there are also opportunities to develop carbon trading, which can benefit African countries. And we'll go into a little bit of more detail on this opportunity in this presentation. So firstly, some key steps en route to COP27. We just concluded the Maputo climate talks, which took place last week. And this was the opportunity for African academia to share their research that has been done on climate change, and also look at some of the key issues that need to be addressed for Africa to have a successful COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. We will be having the regional roundtables on climate finance, which are starting tomorrow in Addis Ababa, and they flow from tomorrow till Thursday, and you are all welcome to join us virtually for that event. For those who are based in Addis, if you register on the website, you can also participate in person. The regional roundtables are happening also at the same time as the meeting of the African Group of Negotiators. We also have the Conference on Climate and Development in Africa, which was tentatively set for Abuja in mid-August, but those dates have been postponed and new dates will be communicated soon. We have the Africa Climate Week, which is confirmed from the 29th of August to the 1st of September in Gabon. And very importantly, we have a pre-COP27 ministers meeting, which will bring together ministers of finance, environment, and development from the 7th to 9th of September. And the latest information is this will be in Cairo rather than Sharm el-Sheikh. But this meeting will be particularly important to finalize a lot of the asks around financing at COP27. There is a proposed pre-COP27 summit in DRC in October, but dates have not yet been specified. And of course, we have the Sharm el-Sheikh COP itself from the 7th to the 18th of November. Going into a little bit more detail on some of the issues. Firstly, on adaptation and loss and damage. At COP26, the work program was established to define the global goal on adaptation. There were new pledges of contributions of $356 million. This is woefully inadequate and contributes to and constitutes only 5 cents per person in the developing world. The Glasgow Climate Pact also urges developed countries to at least double the provision of climate finance adaptation to developing countries by 2025. And African delegates have been disappointed by the progress made on loss and damage. And unfortunately, this has continued, that trend has continued at the recent talks that took place in Bonn. And the funding for damage caused by climate change is insufficient. And the estimates are that the needs in this regard would be into the trillions of dollars. We should note that African countries are estimated to spend up to 9% of their GDP in responding to 9% of their budgets, in responding to climate disasters. And this is particularly important to keep in mind when we look at the impact of, for example, cyclones in Southern Africa recently, and also when we look at the impact of the drought in Eastern Africa, which occurred over the last 3 years, and which has put about 55 million people at in terms of food insecurity. And this, of course, is coupled with the crisis that is occurring in Ukraine, which has had huge impact on the procurement of food. We also should note that in terms of the principles for loss and damage, which African countries have been putting forward, there has been an emphasis that the mechanism must be just, recognizing that African countries are the most impacted. It must be predictable, meaning that flows of finance must be available and not subject to geopolitics, must be equitable and not increasing the burden on African countries. It must be additional to existing financing, meaning that it cannot just be part of the 100 billion that has been promised, but has to be additional financing, which deals with the immediacy of the problem. There needs to be transparency in the allocation of this finance. It should be accessible to all countries. It should be owned by countries, particularly in Africa, that are the most impacted. And it must be aligned with the science and be fit for purpose according to the scale of the impact. A little bit more detail on the just energy transition. We can see from the graph on the left that Africa in blue has the smallest contribution to climate change than any region. And this is particularly in relation to the population in Africa. In all scenarios, if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals using existing technologies, there will be an increase in generation of energy from African countries. The critical aspect is to be able to invest in renewable energy and then ensure that any new investment that is done in fossil fuels doesn't lead to stranded assets, meaning that that African countries have to take care not to invest in technologies that will become defunct and therefore be faced with infrastructure which over the longer term will become very expensive. Renewable energy is the most cost effective for African countries, but to properly access renewable energy, it has to be accompanied by appropriate transition plans. To meet the Sustainable Development Goal objective of universal access to electricity, Africa will need to double its present electricity generation capacity by 2030 and multiply it by 5 by 2050. This represents a $500 billion investment to add the 250 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. I will not go into detail on this slide, but this outlines the existing resources available in Africa, both in terms of non-renewable resources as well as renewable resources. It's important to keep these resources in mind because to be able to increase the renewable resources, there has to be nonetheless a targeted use of the resources that are available from the non-renewables to address Africa's base generation capacity. So one of the solutions to address this is to look at gas as a transition fuel. Now, I would like to be very clear that there is not a one-size-fits-all for African countries. Every African country is working on a transition plan that is fit for purpose based on its own resources. There are some African countries that may be blessed with large geothermal energy opportunities, for example, and they may be able to move faster towards renewables and minimizing the new investment in fossil fuels because they will be able to use geothermal energy as base generation. Other countries may be able to use hydro energy for base generation. And this is the case, for example, of Ethiopia, where I am currently based. But for a large number of countries that do not have access to large-scale hydro, or large-scale hydro may be affected by climate change, the reliability of that hydro may be challenged, or they do not have access to other forms of base generation, they will have to invest in some form of fossil fuel to be able to address that base generation. Assessment that has been done by a number of experts has shown that using natural gas as the basis of that transition would represent the least impact in terms of emissions, while also leading to the least risk of stranding those assets, meaning that the investment in gas could be then used for other purposes. So for example, in many countries, investing in natural gas will make sense as part of the transition away from the use of firewood, for example, as a cooking option. In other countries, it will be important for the use in terms of the value chain for fertilizer production. And we have seen that importance, particularly in the context of the current crisis. So if you look at the first part of the graph, of the 2018 scenario, this looks at the scale of the share of energy by energy type in 2018. Based on a stated policies scenario, meaning the existing scenario that was using 2018 as the baseline, you can see that the amount of generation from coal and gas would increase relatively significantly, including that of oil, which is in light green and in hydro. If, however, we look at a more specific Africa case that uses gas as a transition energy, which is the 2040 Africa case, we can see that you can actually increase the amount of generation from solar in particular and from wind because you will have addressed a large part of the base generation issue. And this allows more renewables to be brought online and then gradually, therefore, decreases the cost of renewable energy. So therefore, in the majority of scenarios, and the gas represents an interesting opportunity for the transition. We would like to stress once again that this is not a one-size-fits-all scenario, and this represents the case for countries that may currently have large amounts of coal, large amounts of oil, but have limited other resources, and to be able to bring themselves into a scenario where they can make the most of renewable energy by investing in base generation. If they are to choose between which fossil fuel, gas would be the most appropriate in this context. African countries through the African Union have actually adopted a common position on the energy transition, which has been presented in the AU summit, which took place last month. This common position essentially recognizes that natural gas would have this temporary role, with oil and coal to be phased out in the medium term, and allowing more investment in renewable energy, particularly solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and biomass. And it is important to note also that African countries have looked at nuclear energy and green hydrogen as being also enablers of this transition. The pillars that would allow this transition to be implemented include financing, the appropriate availability of funds to invest in these sectors, and this will be a key part of the discussions on the climate finance roundtables taking place as of tomorrow, and also the pre-COP27 meeting. One of the other prerequisites is regional integration, and particularly the use of regional power pools, the appropriate implementation of policies and regulatory frameworks, and the availability of the best technology, which ensures that African countries will have access to the appropriate technology to allow them to achieve access at least cost. We'll now look at the climate finance pathway. One of the key goals of COP27 will be to have a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. In 2021, the mobilization of finance was estimated at $80 billion by the OECD, which is obviously short of the 100 billion commitment that had been made. The estimate is that by 2025, and the commitment that was reaffirmed in Glasgow was that 500 billion total would have been mobilized by 2025, representing the 100 billion per year from 2020, meaning that in 2022, there should be an increase in the rate of financing and an acceleration which would allow the 500 billion to be mobilized by 2025. The key element from the position of African negotiators is that the 100 billion in any case was insufficient. And from 2025, the working premise is on a goal of about 1.3 trillion US dollars, but this will be further broken down. And one of the priorities will be to have more transparency on the climate financing goal, recognizing that there are countries that currently are double counting their climate finance commitments. There are countries that are removing financing commitments from other sectors to count it as climate finance. And it will be very important that there is a much more objective criteria around climate finance, that there is more clarity on the amounts that would be available as grants, because the most vulnerable countries will require access to these grants, that there is more clarity also on the financing that will be available through multilateral development banks, for example, through the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust of the IMF, and that there is also clarity on the amount that would come from the private sector, recognizing that in all scenarios, there would have to be a strong engagement, in particular of Africa's private sector, to make the most of the investment opportunity. Very obviously, Africa did not receive the mobilization of financing for its needs, and only 7.5% of its needs were achieved between 2014 and 18. On average, 70 billion is required annually to adapt to climate change. African countries are losing on average 5% of GDP because of climate change. And 3 trillion US dollars is required to implement the NDCs. And the current trends, Africa's NDCs will remain off track because a large amount of those NDCs are dependent on the commitments that would come from partners with limited capacity for domestic resource mobilization. I'll move on to carbon credits because this is an area where ECA is providing support to a number of countries, particularly because this represents an opportunity for African countries to mobilize their own resources in a reliable and transparent way. Carbon credit trading under Article 6.2, the guidance will be elaborated in 2022 and is one of the issues to be taken up at COP27. And under Article 6.4, an appropriate supervisory body is to be established to allow this trading to take place with objective criteria. The work on the processes for implementation of the 6.4 mechanism is currently being done, and the design and implementation of a capacity building program to assist countries wishing to voluntarily participate in this mechanism. Article 6.8 also provides for a framework for non-market-based approaches, and this committee will take the work forward in 2022. So the opportunity for African countries is that African countries are the guardians of some of the world's most important natural sequestration assets. So even without looking at the opportunity for sequestration by or reduction in carbon emissions by looking at energy, for example, which is often the most obvious, even looking just at nature-based opportunity, African countries can meet 30% of the world's sequestration need by 2050. This is because of large-scale assets that exist, even though they are currently under threat. We know that the rate of deforestation in Africa is the highest among all regions of the world, and therefore also a well-structured carbon credit system can allow African countries to protect at-risk resources and generate income from the protection of those resources. Critically also, there are opportunities to develop, for example, climate-smart agricultural techniques, which reduce emissions, but also raise revenues and create livelihoods. So 5 to 15% of the IPCC estimated global need for annual removal can be achieved by sequestration in using these nature-based opportunities in Africa. And this can be done by either partially removing or sequestering emissions or avoiding emissions through the protection of carbon sinks, such as those available in the Congo Basin. Regionally, there are some regions that have more opportunity, including, for example, Central and East Africa. But I would like to make clear that this slide emphasizes nature-based removal and sequestration capacity. And countries in Northern Africa, which have perhaps less of this potential, can do a lot in terms of using energy-based removal to generate carbon credits. I should stress that this slide also looks at only land-based sequestration, and there are a large number of countries that have opportunities by protecting resources such as mangroves to also generate additional sequestration, and sequestration that potentially can be monetized. So through nature-based carbon removal, Africa can generate a revenue of about between 15 and $82 billion per year, depending on the price of carbon. If there is one microphone that is open, I would just request that it is muted because it's creating background noise. Thank you so much. So Africa can generate a revenue of between $15 billion and $82 billion, depending on the price of carbon. At $50 per ton, the revenue potential from nature carbon sequestration and removal would be $15 billion US. So $50 US per ton is currently quite a high price for Africa. The average in Africa is currently about $10 per ton. But with the appropriate creation of high integrity registries, there is an opportunity to raise the price for carbon credits, I'm sorry. So some of the work that ECA is doing is supporting the countries of the Congo Basin, for example, to be able to create a high value and high integrity regional registry, which would allow them to issue carbon credits at a higher price. If we are to go at $120 per ton, which is nearer to the price that will be required to actually meet the sequestration needs globally, then the revenue potential would be $82 billion US. In all scenarios, if the right projects are chosen, a significant number of livelihoods can be created as well. So for example, at $50 per ton, up to 19 million livelihoods, and at $120 per ton, up to 46 million livelihoods. So some of the other areas that the ECA is supporting is the use of market-based mechanisms such as green bonds, and using these as a means to also address some of Africa's debt needs and being able to refinance a portion of Africa's debts. While there are continuing conversations which are extremely valid as to whether Africa should explore these market-based mechanisms, recognizing that the most vulnerable countries need primarily grants, it should be noted that the scale of investment that is required will require at least some engagement of the private sector. And one of the key goals of ECA is to ensure that the private sector also in the continent is actually empowered to be able to be part of this process and to also gain a bigger share of the opportunity for financing using green market-based mechanisms. Currently, Africa is only tapping into 0.4% of global green bond issuances, and Middle East and Africa together are 1% of global bond issuances. This is against the backdrop where green bond issuances have increased dramatically even throughout the pandemic. You can see that on the graph on the right, between 2021 and 2020, the number of green bond issuances or sustainable debt issuances, which included green bonds, SDG-linked bonds, and other mechanisms, those issuances more than doubled just between 2020 and 2021. But Africa is being left behind in this type of financing. And to stress again, African countries should aim to mobilize more grant resources to deal with their immediate emergencies and tap into financing that will help them address their resilience. But there should be an opportunity to also mobilize market-based finance, developing the banking sector across the continent and allowing the more flow of finance into this type of instruments. So some of the ways in which we can make these types of instruments more accessible for African countries is to move towards key performance indicators for the issuance of green, blue, and blue bonds. One of the reasons that green and blue bonds have not been used extensively by African countries is also the capacity that this requires in treasury teams, for example. But moving towards key performance indicators would be a way for African countries to themselves set goals that are climate aligned and which are also aligned with their development needs. And the bond issuance would essentially then be linked to the goal that is set in a sovereign way by the country itself. So some examples of indicators are listed here. You can have a classically climate-linked type of performance indicator. So for example, about on the bottom right, you will see in relation to the tons of CO2 which are sequestered, or the potential or the percentage of the population who now have access to renewable energy. Or it could be a percentage of land that is restored, for example, in the context of land restoration, or it could be in the context of ocean-based resilience, the amount of protected area which is protected for fish reproduction. So these are some examples in the way in which we hope to make these types of instruments more available for African countries. And these types of instruments would then allow African countries, certainly those that already have market access, to also be able to refinance some of their existing more expensive debt at more affordable, in a more affordable way, and link the issuances of their bonds to goals that are associated with climate resilience. So these represent some of the areas that ECA is working on to support African countries. And we look forward for your questions on any of these initiatives to go into more detail, or around the various convenings that we are doing ahead of COP27. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Thanks indeed. It's that time for us to open it up. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I already see a number of hands. I personally have a number of questions, but I'll let them go first. So, Brian, you're on the screen. I'm assuming it's because you have a question and you were granted access. You go ahead. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my name is Brian Gogi from the Nation Media Group in Nairobi, Kenya. My question was, you mentioned the importance of renewable energy, like countries with abundant geothermal resources like Kenya, how they can utilize their resources in this transition. So we have seen most of the geothermal projects are capital intensive, and you've also mentioned the challenges with the raising resources. So how do countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, who already have abundant geothermal resources, how important are these resources in this crucial transition? Thanks.
Thank you. We have I see 3 hands, so we would go with Sarah from Devex, and then we go to Christopher, Bendana, and then Adam, Danzi, Togo, in that order. So Sarah, you go first.
Thank you so much. So these were represented as demands from African nations. I'm wondering if there is debate among these demands, on these demands among nations, and if so, what do these discussions include? Thank you.
Christopher?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I'm glad to hear from you. My question is, I've heard that many African countries are facing the challenge of raising capital to exploit the gas we are talking about. Countries like Uganda here, they have moved to Germany, and all banks have refused to give them money. I'm wondering, how do you see this challenge? How are you going to address it? Or the conservationists say that instead of investing the money in liquid gas, maybe would invest the money in, say, tourism, because some of this exploitation of oil is taking in rich biodiversity areas that would provide income through tourism.
Christopher, which media outlet was that again, please, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'm a Ugandan journalist, freelance. I contribute to the Thomson Reuters, but I also contribute to the Ugandan newspaper called The New Vision.
Thank you very much. So for this set, we'll get the last one from Adam, and then we'll come back to the rest. Thanks. Adam, you have the floor.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour, Monsieur Jean-Paul Adam. Je suis Edem Dadi, journaliste résident au Togo. Alors, je vous ai suivi avec attention parler de la décision de l'Union africaine de faire du du gaz et puis aussi du nucléaire, un peu comme l'Union européenne l'a décidé de faire de ce type d'énergie disons, un tremplin vers la transition énergétique. Alors, est-ce que ce n'est pas cela qui encourage, par exemple, le gouvernement de la RDC à décider d'octroyer des blocs pétroliers et gaziers dans les aires protégées du bassin du Congo? Alors, c'est vrai qu'il est difficile. Il est difficile aujourd'hui de dire à un gouvernement de ne pas exploiter ses ressources pour aider ses populations. C'est difficile, on comprend. Mais en même temps, quelles sont les mesures qui sont prises pour protéger les aires protégées? Parce que la société civile se plaint quand même de cette décision-là. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. So Jean-Paul, over to you, and then we'll come back to the rest later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So starting with Brian's question, I think you have hit the nail on the head that the biggest barrier for African countries is the ability to mobilize capital for these capital intensive projects. Renewable energy is very capital intensive, particularly at the start. What is very positive about renewable energy is that the return on investment is phenomenal. And in Africa, because of the very strong resources associated with renewable, meaning that the return on investment is even more exciting with great potential going forward. The other very interesting aspect for African countries is that even producers of energy today, those that are exporting oil and gas, they have been extremely hard hit by the rise in prices globally, because even though they're exporters where they get a windfall, domestic consumption is dramatically impacted. And overall, the economies are not necessarily feeling the full impact of these windfalls. The advantage of renewable energy is, of course, that you go into your base cost, which is the base cost of most economic production, starts with energy. So once you have achieved base generation capacity, then the long-term costs of renewable energy make the majority of production much more affordable. So it is actually a very strategic decision for Africa to ensure that investments lead us on a low carbon growth. The key element that the ECA is advocating in the context of the raising of capital is that this return on investment and benefit must be recognized in the mechanisms that we put at the disposal of African countries. So this means one of the reasons the capital is not flowing into these projects is the perception of risk on the continent. So one of the main areas is about risk mitigation on the availability of financing from the private sector. So for example, the UNECA has advocated for a liquidity and sustainability facility, which would reduce the cost of capital from the private sector into these high capital intensive projects. In some cases, those projects will also require the injection of grant financing, which has to come from the commitment of the 100 billion and for the sums that would be committed as of 2025 for the increase in climate financing. The issue of raising of capital is at the heart of many of the key issues that will be addressed at COP27 and which African countries are putting at the forefront. But I think the biggest aspect that has to be addressed in the immediate is the reduction of risk associated with these investments and upfront, or rather front-loading these investments so we can get the benefit. Regarding to the second point from Sarah, so these points that I've shared are not necessarily the final position of the African group of negotiators. I think we have to be clear that the final priority positions for African countries will be determined by the Conference of African Heads of State on Climate Change, or CAOSC. They have the ultimate authority to define a common position for African countries. And of course, they do so on the basis of a discussion with the Africa group of negotiators. And the UNECA as a UN agency is working closely with the African group of negotiators to support this process. The various issues that we have presented in this call are a summary of some of the key issues that are being debated and areas where ECA is providing technical support. You will notice that a number of these initiatives are around raising additional capital which is at the crux of the challenge which we will face at COP27. At COP27, there is a very big push by African countries to ensure that there is additional finance that is committed. Realistically, I think a large number of countries have recognized that with the likelihood of a global recession, new financing is going to be very hard to come by. Therefore, there is a need to explore every avenue of potential to raise financing, and hence some of the work that we are doing, which is focusing on some of these mechanisms that can raise money using capital markets, for example. I think it's important to note that among African countries, there are many differences of opinion. So by no means should you take our presentation as being indicative of a final African position, but it is an indication of the issues under discussion. On the questions from Christopher about raising capital for gas, there are a number of countries that, and there are a number of institutions, financing institutions that are actually moving their portfolio away from investing in any form of fossil fuel. This is the reality of investment globally, is that big banks will tend to invest more in renewables anyway, partly because the return on investment is better, also because of their own internal goals that they have set aligned to the Paris Agreement. So there will be a challenge to continue to raise financing in these areas. The arguments that the UNECA and the African Union and other partners are putting forward is that we must look at any investment in fossil fuels in Africa, such as gas, as part of the transition. So meaning we are encouraging African countries to ensure that they indicate very transparently the areas that they feel that they need to develop as part of their transition towards renewable energy. What African countries need to take a lot of care in is that if they are investing in fossil fuels, those fossil fuels are truly helping them to achieve the least cost in the future for generation of energy. What some of the concerns that we would express based on analysis that we've done is that some African countries are being caught in a scenario where they're being convinced by big multinational companies to invest in fossil fuels that may not have a long-term viability, because as renewables become even cheaper and battery technologies advance, they are at very big risk of having big investments, but which deliver large profits for the big companies in the first few years, but in the long term become white elephants that are not actually sustainable for the development of the economy and do not provide low-cost energy in the long term, which all assessments show that renewable energy will offer that best opportunity. The key element is to properly define the transition. And in terms of the opportunity cost from investing in, for example, ecotourism, certainly for a number of countries, there has to be a very careful assessment of, is the investment in those fossil fuels really necessary relative to the needs of the country and the transition that will be done? And does this then reduce the opportunity for investing in other areas that could raise additional finance, such as ecotourism? And I've also mentioned in the presentation the opportunity, for example, for carbon credits. And some of the analysis that has been done is that if you have a predictable carbon credit market, African countries may be able to actually benefit a lot more from the issuance of carbon credits than they may from fossil fuels. So the investment in fossil fuels should be looked at in the context of a transition, which allows then African countries to have long-term access to affordable energy. Et justement, sur la dernière question de Edem, je crois que la position de l'Union africaine, c'est justement de créer ce tremplin pour un investissement dans l'énergie renouvelable à long terme qui sera beaucoup plus compétitif par rapport au prix actuellement des hydrocarbures, par exemple. Nous vivons actuellement un moment très difficile sur le plan du prix de l'énergie globale. Et le risque avec les hydrocarbures, c'est qu'il y aura toujours cette tendance dans des périodes de crise à avoir une explosion dans les prix et qui se traduit directement à un impact sur les populations. Mais l'avantage avec les énergies renouvelables, c'est que à long terme, vous avez un prix qui est beaucoup plus abordable et un prix qui est aussi beaucoup plus facile à prédire, et alors faire des budgets qui sont beaucoup plus adaptés et de ne pas être affectés par cette inflation dramatique énergétique. En ce qui concerne les investissements dans l'énergie, et surtout, il faut reconnaître qu'il y a 23 pays en Afrique, presque la moitié, que moins de 50% de la population n'ont pas accès à l'énergie. Dans ce contexte, l'investissement nécessaire est énorme et certainement, il faudra le développement de nouveaux projets aussi qui sont liés aux hydrocarbures. Mais il faut certainement, et je ne peux pas me prononcer sur le cas spécifique de la RDC, mais ce que je pourrais dire d'une manière générale, l'analyse qu'a fait la CEA et d'autres partenaires, c'est que le potentiel de générer, par exemple, des revenus par les crédits de carbone pourrait largement dépasser l'opportunité, par exemple, à travers les hydrocarbures. Et ce que tous les pays africains doivent faire très attention, c'est de ne pas créer des investissements dans les hydrocarbures qui bénéficient des grandes compagnies multinationales, mais qui amènent très peu aux populations. Et c'est ça le risque qu'il faut réduire. Il faudra que les gouvernements prioritisent des investissements qui bénéficient les populations. Et si c'est bien fait, les aires protégées peuvent contribuer dans ce sens. Mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y aura pas d'investissement dans des hydrocarbures parce que les besoins énergétiques en Afrique sont immenses. Thanks, Ernest. So I see we've got a few more questions, and I'll try to be shorter in my next answers.
Right, wonderful. Actually, there's a question from Bakary Dabo. It's from, he works with All Africa. It's in the chat box, and it's in French. If you could just read that. He's kind of asking, if you've been able to quantify the expected share of the private sector to fill the financing gap. But also he talked about an initiative called Gas to Power in Senegal, and asked, why is it that gas is not one of the priority areas of focus when it comes to energy transition? What analysis do you have? But I'll let you take a look at that question because it's in French. Now we have three hands, so I'd like to go first with Zubaida, and then followed by Sophia Fagru, and then Bibish can come third. So Zubaida, you have the floor, please.
Yes, good morning from Ghana. Good afternoon to those of us in East Africa and other places. So my name is Zubaida Mabuna Ismail. I'm a freelance journalist based in Ghana, and of course from Ghana. I have three questions. My first question is that when we keep hearing or we keep saying that Africa is the worst impacted when it comes to climate change, in simple terms, how would you want to explain that to a journalist so that we are able to also translate that to our audiences? Because we keep saying that it's become more of a cliche, but how do we explain that to the lame people so that they would be able to also take part in this fight against climate change and mitigating the impacts on Africans? So that is one. My second question is that the ECA has alluded to the fact that the $100 billion promised by the world's biggest emitters, which they have not even fulfilled, is not enough to help poor countries or low-income countries to mitigate the impact of climate change. And so there is, you've been able to quantify what you need, and it would be presented this at the next COP, which is supposed to be in Africa. However, my question then is, how are you ensuring that moving forward, these promises are fulfilled? Because yes, we had one about 2 years back, nothing has happened. We're going to present another to them. How are we ensuring that they keep to their promises when it comes to climate financing? Yeah, thank you. I think that is it.
Thank you very much. Is it Sophia now, please? If you could just keep it straight to the question. We've got 9 minutes to go. We could go a little bit overboard, but let's try to keep it straight to the question.
Bonjour. Bonjour, je m'appelle Sophia Fagroud, je suis journaliste marocaine. Tout d'abord, Monsieur Jean-Paul Adam, au tout début de votre intervention, vous avez brièvement parlé de la question de l'obsolescence, des technologies qui peuvent être obsolètes généralement. Et moi, ça me fait réfléchir parce que, par exemple, au Maroc, nous avons une grande station solaire dans le sud du Maroc, c'est l'une des plus grandes d'ailleurs d'Afrique. Et 5 ans après son lancement, on a dit, bah, finalement, la technologie était trop coûteuse. Elle est toujours coûteuse par rapport, par exemple, au photovoltaïque qui coûtait 80% moins cher sur le marché après 10 ans. Aujourd'hui, par exemple, au Maroc, on ne parle plus beaucoup du solaire ou de l'éolien, on parle, par exemple, de l'hydrogène vert. Et moi, ma question est la suivante. Comment éviter de mettre en place des technologies qui deviennent par la suite obsolètes, d'autant plus que les prix des matières premières pour la production de l'énergie renouvelable, l'énergie propre, sont très volatiles sur le marché mondial. Merci.
Thank you, Sophia. Very quickly, someone raised a concern that the interpretation in French is not working. Is that still the case? Is it resolved, or can someone confirm, please, to make sure that French speakers?
C'est revenu. It's back now.
It's back now. Okay, wonderful. So Bibish Ngua, please. Bibish, you have the floor. You are muted. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you. You're muted. Bibish, vous êtes muté. How do you say to unmute? You have to unmute your.
Vous devez activer votre micro. You have to activate your microphone.
Toujours pas. Toujours pas. So maybe we go to there was a fourth person, to Ndamui Sandu, and then we'll come back in the meantime.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Ndamu, journalist from Zimbabwe. My question is, how does Africa fare in terms of global carbon pricing initiatives in relation to other regions? What could be the reasons behind the low activities? And then the second question is, what is holding back the setting up of a supervisory board when we are speaking of the carbon markets? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we just take the last one for the set? Ernest Agbota, please. Ernest, are you there? If not, maybe Jean-Paul, you could go ahead and then they'll come later, just so we save time. Is that okay?
Thank you, Ernest, and thank you everyone for those really great questions. So firstly, to take the questions in the chat. Alors, la question de Bakary. Nous n'avons pas jusqu'à maintenant défini les besoins ou la part attendue du secteur privé. Et nous partons au départ sur le principe de qu'est-ce qu'on a besoin en termes de dons, et après que le secteur privé puisse combler le manque après avoir défini le besoin en termes de dons. Cela est important parce que pour beaucoup de pays d'Afrique, la capacité, par exemple, d'absorption des ressources du secteur privé est limitée. Si nous allons dans un marché qui est très fragile, dans un pays qui est très fragile, c'est difficile au départ, par exemple, de faire un investissement conséquent. Mais il y a quand même eu des exemples intéressants. Je note en Somalie, par exemple, que l'ONU a facilité un investissement public-privé par un acteur privé, justement pour créer de l'énergie pour les camps qui sont établis par l'ONU. Et c'est un premier départ qui permet un investissement privé. Mais la priorité pour les négociateurs africains, c'est de définir les besoins en termes de dons et suite à cela, d'identifier les opportunités d'investissement qui existent déjà. Il y a beaucoup d'opportunités dans le secteur de l'énergie, par exemple, et l'exemple cité du Sénégal est très important. et le gaz n'est pas cité comme source privilégiée parce que pour certains pays, c'est vu comme un risque, mais je crois qu'après cette décision de l'Union africaine, nous allons voir une évolution dans cette position. Et je pense aussi que le gaz est de plus en plus défini dans le contexte de la transition. I note the question also from Addis Getachew on the green bonds. One of the main reasons is that the development of capital markets in Africa is more limited anyway, and so there is less capacity. We hope to address this by, as I mentioned in the presentation, simplifying the issuance of green bonds and linking that to direct needs of countries through the use of key performance indicators. And we think this will be one way to facilitate that, as well as supporting the reduction in cost of the issuance of these bonds. Sur les questions de Zubaida, sur les sorry, Zubaida was in English, sorry. The questions on how to define the impact and showcase this for African citizens. I think there are many different ways, but one of the ways that I think that for me certainly is striking, African countries on average are spending 9% of their budgets. So that means that for every $100 that governments are spending, $9 is being removed right at the outset, just paying for climate change. So it means that you have this, essentially climate change is putting a tax on African countries that is higher relative to incomes in other countries. And this is because of the limited capacity on the continent. But I would also point out that on the continent, the impact is more immediately felt. There are 55 million food insecure people in the Horn of Africa right now. And this is not only related to climate change, it's also due to the rise in cost of food prices globally. But a big part of it is due to climate change because harvests have not been as good as they would have been if you didn't have these multiple years of drought. In terms of measuring the promises, there is a goal to have a transparent framework for reporting on climate finance. And this is one of the key issues and discussion at COP27. Then, la question de Sophia sur l'obsolescence de technologie. Je crois qu'il y a toujours, quand il y a une nouvelle technologie, vous avez cité l'exemple du solaire au Maroc, mais je crois que si on prend l'exemple du Maroc, malgré que la technologie a été vite dépassée par les photovoltaïques, par exemple, je suis sûr que je suis sûr que l'analyse qui a été faite démontre néanmoins que malgré que la manque d'efficacité de ce projet, c'est par rapport aux nouvelles technologies, c'est-à-dire les photovoltaïques. Mais une fois que l'investissement a été fait, je suis sûr que l'énergie qui a été générée, parce qu'avec le solaire, le coût, c'est au départ. Mais le coût à long terme, que ce soit photovoltaïque ou même des technologies plus anciennes, à long terme, vous avez un coût réduit de la génération d'énergie. Et alors, dans tout ce qui est renouvelable, dans le moyen à long terme, vous allez avoir un rapport génération-prix qui est beaucoup plus avantageux. Et l'obsolescence est surtout grave dans le contexte des hydrocarbures parce que vous avez un risque de ne pas pouvoir utiliser ces technologies parce qu'elle est devenue trop chère et le coût de remplacement devient trop cher. Il y a toujours un risque quand il y a une nouvelle technologie que cette technologie sera rapidement dépassée, mais avec, par exemple, les technologies de batterie qui sont en train d'évoluer, même des anciennes technologies solaires deviendront plus performantes. Et il y a la possibilité, avec le coût réduit aussi de ces nouvelles technologies de photovoltaïque, de graduellement pouvoir remplacer des investissements qui ont été faits dans le passé. Je dirais que le risque d'obsolescence est beaucoup plus fort avec des technologies qui sont associées avec les hydrocarbures, parce que si on prend par exemple le charbon, il y a beaucoup de compagnies malheureusement qui essayent de vendre leurs technologies en Afrique, mais des technologies qui sont très mauvaises pour la santé à travers les émissions de gaz nocifs. Et nous devons faire attention en Afrique de ne pas accepter des technologies qui sont déjà dépassées. Je crois que j'ai répondu à toutes les questions. I think I've covered most of the questions.
Okay, so let's thank you very much, Jean-Paul.
Sorry, very quickly, there was one on the low activity in the carbon market and the supervision. So just very, very quickly on that one, the main reason is that the market is not well developed on the continent through the establishment of what's called a high integrity registry for carbon emissions. So the majority of countries in the continent do not have this registry to measure carbon emissions and therefore trade them. And this is some of the capacity that we are working to build. And then in terms of the establishment of a supervisory body at the global level, there are obviously a lot of countries that are resistant to having a global carbon price because they may be invested in the fossil fuel sector. But we are hopeful that there will be progress at COP27. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bibish, you're on the screen, so we'll go with you.
Allô, vous m'entendez? Ah, ok. Merci beaucoup. J'avais deux petites questions après avoir suivi l'intervenant de tout à l'heure. La toute première, c'est en rapport avec le financement. Nous comprenons qu'il sera difficile de lutter contre le changement climatique sans faire allusion au financement. Or, cette question des financements, il y a plus de déclarations qui sont faites, mais en termes d'action, les actions ne sont pas à la hauteur des déclarations qui sont faites. On comprend que c'est quelque chose qui nous fait traîner parce qu'on essaie de comprendre tous que le financement se présente comme étant un impératif dans la lutte contre le changement climatique. Et la deuxième question, je me focaliserai sur le marché carbone. Il a présenté le marché carbone comme étant une opportunité. Déjà, si le prix du carbone était revu à la hausse, c'est-à-dire arrivé par exemple à $120, ce qui donnerait plus ou moins 82 milliards de dollars l'an, ce qu'il a dit tout à l'heure. Je sais par exemple qu'ici, chez nous, en République démocratique du Congo, le chef de l'État plaider à ce que ce prix carbone soit revu à la hausse, par exemple, à $100. Lui, au moins, il est allé jusqu'à 120. Ça aiderait quand même à ceux-là qui conservent les forêts, à ceux-là qui les protègent, de pouvoir se retrouver. Mais aujourd'hui, déjà, il y a un confrère qui m'a précédé pour évoquer l'affaire des blocs pétroliers, les 27 blocs pétroliers. Donc, on comprend que ça va dans le même sens. Or, si on misait plus sur le marché carbone, ça allait quand même nous aider à voir les choses autrement. Est-ce qu'il peut nous donner quelques conseils par rapport à ça?
Thank you, Bibish. Jean-Paul, I don't know if you can see the questions in the chat box. We've got a number of them. You want to check those out? So we've got Abu J, who says, what's the future of Africa in terms of fossil fuel investment? And then there's Charles Ogalo, who says, what should Africa expect from Egypt, the UN Climate Change Conference, in terms of climate financing and clean development mechanism, CDM? Yes, and then there is Ernest now, who finally asked this question in French. It's in the chat box. I'll leave that for you to pick up.
So firstly, I think the question about the future of fossil fuel investment on the continent and the question from Ernest are linked. The fossil fuels on the continent should be, the new developments in those fields should be defined as part of the transition plan. Fossil fuels risk being costly for African countries in the long term because renewables costs are dramatically reducing. So there is a rush to diversify into other fossil fuel forms now by European countries because of the crises. But this is potentially a short-term issue. And African countries have to make sure that we do not fall into the trap into investing in something which then is going to be stranded in the longer term. But there will be a need for investment in fossil fuels as part of the transition. And it's important that each country can establish its pathway in line with the resources that it has. Alors, juste rapidement sur la question de Ernest, c'est l'économie décarbonée. En fait, il faudra une exploitation du pétrole qui continue, mais qui est associée au plan de transition du continent. Sur les questions des crédits de carbone en RDC, je crois que le potentiel est surtout annuel de revenus pour parler à travers les crédits de carbone est potentiellement beaucoup plus élevé que même à travers les hydrocarbures. Le problème qui se pose, c'est bien sûr que ces marchés, pour l'instant, n'existent pas. Il faudra qu'il y ait un prix plus élevé. Nous essayons d'arriver à cela à travers les négociations qui auront lieu à la COP27, mais aussi à travers le renforcement des capacités dans les différents pays pour établir un marché national pour les crédits de carbone à travers un registre pour mieux mesurer les émissions de gaz à effet de serre et de pouvoir monétiser justement ce capital naturel énorme qui existe surtout dans le bassin du Congo, mais aussi sur tout le continent africain, et de lier ce capital naturel aux opportunités pour les populations d'avoir une meilleure vie. And then the final question on the clean development mechanism, the expectation at COP27 is that there would be this new supervisory body which would help facilitate the actual establishment of a global carbon price, which would be aligned with the need for decarbonization. The IMF have estimated that to limit warming to 2 degrees will require a carbon price of at least $80. So therefore, the expectation is that we go in that direction. It will not necessarily be easy, and it may not happen at COP27 itself, but the hope is that we can go in that direction, or at least make progress towards that. Thank you very much, Ernest. And I think I will have to wrap up also because I have another meeting.
Okay, all right. If that's the case, then I think we'll call it here. Just to say thank you very much, Jean-Paul, and thank you to all the colleagues for connecting and all the very interesting questions. What that tells me is that people are passionate about the subject. But also just to inform you that Jean-Paul, as well as members of his team, will be available to take any questions, to do interviews. If you do have questions, please do not hesitate to send them to us. If you want to do video interviews or written interviews, we are available to assist with that. That said, also the slides will be shared. I think a few people asked. We'll be sharing the slides with you, and do not hesitate to get to us if you need any assistance. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Thank you, colleagues, and
thank you so much.
A wonderful.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks indeed. Nice day to everybody.